Bree, what's on your radar?
Can you legislate culture? Should you? These are questions that have been on my mind since 10 people were killed in a Buffalo supermarket 2 weeks ago by a self-described white supremacist, and 19 children and 2 teachers were murdered last week in Uvalde, Texas. Since those 2 incidents, the country has been embroiled in deep, largely good faith conversations about how to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. The depravity of these events, the repugnance of the Buffalo shooter's open hatred of Black and Jewish people, the absolute cruelty of targeting elementary school children for an attack has fostered a real appetite for reform. The only question is what to do. Historically, solutions have been split on a partisan basis. Conservatives, wary of infringements on Second Amendment rights, have been hesitant to adopt gun control measures, which they see as part of a larger liberal agenda to make it next to impossible to own guns. Instead, they tend to emphasize mental health interventions, the insidious influence of violent video games, and call for increased funding for police, along with increased police presences in school. Sometimes they even call for teachers to be armed. Also, there's this.
It was initially reported that he was a user. In fact, he got angry that his grandmother and his mother didn't want him to use marijuana. But again, we don't know more. It was just mysteriously taken out of an article in the New York Times. But why aren't people in general not talking more about the pot, psychosis, violent behavior connection?
Well, that's a very good question, Laura.
Liberals see these policy interventions as insufficient at best and a bad faith distraction at worst. Because conservatives, ideologically committed to small government at all costs, rarely if ever propose the types of mental health interventions that might actually prevent men and boys from becoming mass shooters, liberals tend to be somewhat dismissive of arguments about mental health as a primary cause. The same goes for violence in video games, which feels to liberals like an excuse to avoid the issue of guns, especially since decades of research have shown that while violent video games have a desensitizing effect on kids, they do not cause the type of violence we've seen over the last 2 weeks or so. And after the colossal failure of first responders in Uvalde, even conservative voters are shooting down suggestions from Ted Cruz and other top NRA money recipients that the answer is more good guys with guns in school. Enough school resource officers have abandoned their posts during mass shootings for most folks to have abandoned the idea that they should put their children's lives in these people's hands. So what do liberals have on offer? Well, liberals are inclined toward policies that make guns less accessible to those who are inclined to do violence against human beings. Some policies advocated by the left target specific types of guns that are frequently used in mass shootings, rationalizing that if a certain type of gun, like an AR-15, is attractive to mass shooters for whatever reason, they should not be sold to civilians, or at least they should be subject to a higher bar when it comes to background checks or waiting periods. To the extent that conservatives argue that other guns could be used instead or are equally dangerous, the liberal response is to say that those guns should be more difficult to attain too. Most liberals don't have an ideological opposition to gun ownership in principle, but when weighing the pros of gun ownership against the cons of mass shootings, suicides, and organized crime, liberals tend to believe restrictions on gun ownership are worth the cost. Conservatives obviously feel differently, and the tacit, if rarely explicit message is that mass shootings might be the price to pay for freedom. Liberals point to other parts of the free world that don't suffer from America's unique gun violence problem and argue that America's policy priorities are in the wrong place. A world where children are massacred at school, no matter how infrequently, is not a free world, they say. In countries like Australia, which responded to a massacre in 1996 that left 35 dead with a gun buyback program, offer an important example and America should follow. Australia made a number of guns frequently used in shootings illegal, and then offered above-market payments for folks to turn in those guns without penalty, even if they were illegal guns. This resulted in about 20% of privately owned Australian guns being turned in. 80% of guns remained in circulation, but mass shootings stopped. The efficacy of this approach, however, is rarely engaged with by conservative politicians and pundits. Instead, it's presumed that such a program would not work in the United States, and that even 19 dead children are enough to make it worth just trying. Now, there seems to be some bipartisan consensus around red flag laws, which permit police or family members to petition a state court to order the temporary removal of firearms from a person who might present a danger to others or themselves. A judge makes the determination to issue the order based on statements and actions made by the gun owner in question. Red flag laws might be one of the few policies widely supported on a sort of bipartisan basis, though the NRA and conservatives like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Dan Crenshaw oppose them. And where they've been implemented, they've been successful. A Duke University study in 2016 concluded that Connecticut's red flag law averted around 1 suicide for every 10 to 20 gun seizure cases. Red flag laws were successfully adopted in Florida, signed by Republican Governor Rick Scott after the Parkland shooting in 2018. And even since the shooting in Uvalde, several prospective shooters have been flagged following posts on their social media accounts, potentially averting more death. So I'm glad there is a growing consensus around red flag laws. But even Republican legislators who have supported them on the state level reject them on the federal level, leaving the majority of the country, including Texas, where the Uvalde shooting happened, vulnerable to the whims of politicians like Crenshaw. But I remain frustrated that common sense suggestions from both sides aren't getting more of an airing because of the presumed bad faith of the quote-unquote other side. For example, age restrictions seem to be an obviously good idea if we want to prevent school shootings. According to a database project from the Washington Post, which tracks every act of gunfire at primary or secondary school during school hours since the Columbine massacre in 1999, more than 2/3 were committed by shooters under 18. The average age for school shooters was 16. Even outside of school shootings, 26% of all mass shootings are perpetrated by men under the age of 25. The Uvalde shooter bought the gun he used to kill 19 children and 2 teachers legally, a day after his 18th birthday. The Buffalo shooter, also 18, legally purchased his gun in New York. And unlike the Uvalde shooter, had no red flags that would have triggered the state's red flag laws. What could have stopped him, however, is preventing access to the gun in the first place. It's also worth mentioning that he used a high-capacity magazine that is illegal in New York State, which only allows the purchase of magazines that shoot 10 rounds outside of a shooting competition. This underscores why it's so important to have federal gun legislation, because borders are porous. But Republican politicians so far seem to oppose it. Listen to this dodge by Dan Hawthorne being interviewed outside of the Uvalde Middle School.
Congressman, let's get to a couple of other issues because there's so many potential solutions, and I want to hear other ones that you potentially agree with. One is raise the minimum age to purchase a firearm to 21 years old. The shooter in Uvalde, he was only 18. The Buffalo shooter was 18. Sandy Hook shooter was 20 years old. Parkland was 19 years old. Should you be 21 to buy a gun?
Well, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, should 21 be the age that you're an adult? You know, as a society, we do have to decide when you're technically an adult. And right now, we technically say 18. Well, look, I'm not very impressed by our current swath of 18-year-olds and their maturity level. So maybe we should have that conversation. But then it has to apply broadly. It has to mean that you are not an adult until 21. And then, you know, what happens then? When we see a 22-year-old commit an atrocity, are we going to raise it again? And are we going to raise it again? And, you know, at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves what our limiting principle is. As far as that age limit.
Well, I mean,
truthfully, the vast majority
of
these
NIH has
horrible
said that the
shootings have been
teenage
caused by an older
brain
person.
isn't finished developing until mid-20s. There's medical studies that show that the teenage brain just isn't fully developed.
That's true. And does that mean that I think it's 26 actually. And so does that mean you're not an adult until 26? I mean, I think I was on my second deployment by then. So, you know, these are hard questions, and we're grasping for an answer because this is an atrocity that really hits our hard.
Congressman, I mean, I think, I'm guessing there are a lot of people out there watching this, hearing you saying no to a lot of the solutions that people are talking about. So what I think people want to know is, what is the solution? What would you agree with? Because the way that the answers are coming out now, it's that nothing's going to change. And I don't think people here in this community and across the country want to hear that after their babies are being massacred by these guns.
That was Dan Crenshaw, of course. Now, raising the age of gun ownership does not require a comprehensive review of when a person becomes an adult, any more than requiring people to be 25 to rent a car does. And it's this kind of bad faith response that stands in the way of some common sense reforms. As for liberals, I'm frustrated by the extent to which mental health conversations are shut down without an airing. While I understand why mental health is seen as a right-wing pretext to avoid a substantive conversation about gun control measures and how it can bring an undue stigma to people with mental health issues, the overwhelming majority of whom, of course, do not commit crimes, it's quite obviously true that there's something psychological, something perhaps cultural going on with American men. Almost 100% of mass shooters are men. And while women attempt suicide at a higher rate, men are more successful. The suicide rate among American men is on a deeply troubling upward trend, and it's the 12th leading cause of death in the United States. The correlation between the accessibility of guns and the rate of suicide is well documented. Some Republicans brag about high gun possession, low crime rate states like Wyoming, but those states feature some of the highest suicide rates in the country, and that's tragic. To the extent that there is a mental health problem in this country, it's exacerbated by the gun problem. And it's deeply frustrating to be caught in an either-or debate that does nothing to provide for the mental health crisis or the problem of guns getting into the hands of those who would cause harm. Finally, I'm frustrated that there's little appetite for folks to engage in the cultural problem that is adjacent to the mental health crisis. Liberals are right to call out video game panic as a paper tiger, but that doesn't mean that video games aren't a problem in some respects. Chat rooms within games have become core recruiting grounds for extremists. Teenage boys who feel lonely, left behind, and like they're losing power in society they feel entitled to, reclaim that power by participating in an edgelord culture where they engage in subversive speech, less because they have a strong ideology, at least at first, but because it feels good to feel superior in a world where they feel anything but. And extremists know they can offer young people a scapegoat for their social and economic problems. Immigrants, minorities, trans people, social justice warriors. As a leftist, it's painful to see because these kids are somewhat right. The American social contract is not being honored. They've just got the culprit wrong. Wage theft, for example, is rampant in America, but while undocumented immigrants create some increased competition for low-wage jobs, most wage theft is executed by corporations. In 2019 alone, the Department of Labor cited about 8,500 employers for taking about $287 million from workers. And the undocumented are actually huge victims of wage theft for obvious reasons. Their legal status means they can't bring legal claims. Corporate media pundits, funded by some of the most exploitative companies, rarely focus on the real wage thieves, choosing instead to scapegoat some of the lowest earners in the country who pay billions in taxes while unable to access the social programs those taxes fund. The worst offenders are corporations like Halliburton, G4S Wackenhut, and Circle K stores, which have collectively taken more than $22 million from their employees since 2005. Walmart has been penalized with $1.4 billion in total wage theft settlements and fines. Banks and insurance companies are key offenders, with Bank of America paying $381 million in penalties, Wells Fargo $205 million, and JP Morgan Chase $160 million. Here's some testimony from one employee, Killian Collin, from a sanctioned firm. At Wells Fargo, she says, aggressive sales quotas based on exploiting vulnerable customers forced me into 12-hour shifts with no breaks and no food allowed, and threats to withhold my paycheck if I didn't sign off on working extra hours for free. The retail sector has the highest aggregate penalties for wage theft, and that's in a sector that's been fighting minimum wage hikes that would keep up with inflation, fighting a minimum wage that hasn't gone up since 2009, the longest period in American history, all while stealing from employees. Young men are right, it is bleak out there, but instead of being told who the real enemy is by honest actors in the Democratic and Republican parties, they are being propagandized by bigoted extremists. And the corporate parties are making it easy for extremist recruiters by lowering the quality of life for average Americans, enabling Wall Street, sending jobs overseas, and declining to tax the rich, even as the rich steal more and more from workers. Meanwhile, conservatives are reluctant to take a good hard look at gun culture, which goes well beyond protecting our Second Amendment rights and instead pushes the idea that masculine value is bound up with violence. Now, in February, Sandy Hook victims won an unprecedented settlement against gun manufacturer Remington, despite laws shielding manufacturers from liability. Why did they win? Well, plaintiffs argued that the company was culpable because of the way they marketed their products to civilians as a way to kill their enemies. Not to kill deer, not burglars, but their human enemies. Family members of victims argue that ads like this, one which reads, "Consider your man card reissued," motivated Adam Lanza to kill 26 people. Daniel Defense, manufacturer of the AR-15 used in the 2018 Stoneman Douglas shooting, the 2017 Las Vegas slaughter of 58 people, the 2017 Sutherland Springs church shooting in Texas that killed 26 people, the Pulse nightclub shooting, which left 49 dead, the 2015 San Bernardino shooting that left 14 dead, and Sandy Hook is coming under scrutiny for this advertising, which pushes the idea of gun ownership on younger and younger consumers. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Is it possible, in the wake of the horrific tragedies this month, or just last month, to have an honest conversation about gun culture that's separate and apart from gun ownership? Can we disentangle a commitment to Second Amendment rights from a culture which glorifies military-style weapons designed to kill humans and pushed on children? Can Americans on both sides of the ideological divide reckon with the fact that both corporate parties have created an environment so precarious, with so little support for families, that young men see violent extremism as a viable alternative to a socially productive future? Can conservatives that believe mental health is a problem join with leftists who advocate for universal mental health care? Can conservatives that think parents aren't present enough in the home fight with leftists to secure them a living wage so they can be home in time to help their kids with their homework, or even afford to survive on one salary so one parent can be home when their child gets home from school? And can liberals take seriously the threat posed not by video games themselves, but by the communication platforms they provide, and work harder to demonstrate a willingness to materially provide for all Americans, instead of relying on mere lip service to minority groups for votes, followed up by, of course, inaction and excuse making? Can this be a moment for a little good faith? I'm not sure, but here's hoping. So, Kim, I was really struck by what I saw outside of the kind of the mainstream media sphere, people engaging with this issue across the aisle in a way that was heartening. But there still seems to be so much, I think, scarring from years of bad faith fighting, that a lot of good solutions that are being bandied about, which are partially true and would partially help, aren't being fully considered by either side.
Well, that might change through time. I'm hoping that, as you know, we're seeing a cultural shift happen, I think, on the left and the right in the political parties. We're seeing that things are starting to morph, and there's kind of this new realignment sort of happening. And in that new realignment that's happening, this new sort of political shift that's happening on the right and the left, people on, for example, on the right, will say, hey, I'm not so sure about these cops, whereas previously they would always be, oh, no, there's no such thing as a bad cop. We've mentioned that before in the show. And now maybe they're starting to second guess that sort of sentiment. And on the left, we're starting to see some other sentiments even change even after George Floyd. We're seeing, like after January 6th, some people on the left saying, oh, no, I want more, okay, maybe not all cops are so bad. Right, so we're starting to see this sort of almost meeting in the middle in a way, because people are starting to see that it's never just black and white. There's a lot of gray when it comes to everything. So there might be an opportunity as those shifts continue to happen where people start to say, actually, we agree. There are things we do actually agree on. So I'm hoping that even though there's a lot of division in the country right now, we're in a very hyper-politicized environment, I'm hoping that because of this kind of shifting in thinking that is happening on both sides of the aisle, there is sometimes this meeting in the middle a bit, and there's this agreement. But I think you hit a lot of really good points throughout your radar of this is a multi-pronged problem that has a lot of different elements to it. It isn't just one thing that can be done in order to solve the crisis. But I think as more and more people, for example, say what you're saying on the left, if more and more say, hey, it's not just the guns, there's a lot of other things that are going into this, you're going to find those people then on the right that say, you know what, Briahna, I agree with you. And then suddenly you're in that conversation.
Yeah, I think a really key thing, and I've been working on this myself, is that when someone who is maybe ideologically opposed to you proposes a solution, even if there are reasons for you to think it's like a bad faith offer, you gotta just accept it in good faith and ask the kind of follow-ups you would ask if you were engaging with someone you thought was really acting in good faith. Because if you don't, you never get to the bottom of whether or not there's a there, and you basically allow someone to get away with an argument by not interrogating it further. So if someone says, okay, I think the answer is mental health, so many liberals will say, that's just a pretext, I'm not going to engage with you. But if you were to say, okay, so what's your policy prescription for how to deal with this mental health crisis? Either they have one, and great, we can move forward with something that might be productive, or they don't, because they don't actually think it's a mental health issue. They just don't want to talk about gun regulation. And then something has been revealed there. But I think there's been a kind of an impasse in a lot of political discourse because everybody is assuming the worst of everybody. And even if sometimes that is true, it really hurts the quality of the debates that are happening in the public sphere.
Absolutely. I mean, on the right, people feel like anytime there's any discussion about gun control measures, it's really the left's attempt to completely disarm the population. Yeah. So they say, oh, this is just the first step, and then it's just going to continue. And they're not going to stop at bump stocks. And then they're not going to stop at high-capacity magazines. They're going to keep going. Then they're going to go after your semi-automatic rifle. And then they're going to go after, it just goes on and on and on. So there is that shutting down of the debate. But I'm thinking that as we open up the conversation and say this is a multi-pronged problem, suddenly when you're in that conversation with somebody from the opposite side of the aisle, there is something to agree on there. Right. If you just say it's not one thing, it's many things, suddenly, I mean, they can't just reject all of those many things.
Right, exactly.
Or they're going to say, no, actually it is the family, the house, it's the home, it's mental health. And then you can even start to move that into a direction and you say, okay, if you think it's the family and that there's an issue in the home, what can we do to help support families to give them better opportunities to stay home with their children, to be more involved? Like, what can we do? And suddenly you're opening up the conversation. And I think then people find themselves agreeing on many, many points, actually, and not just a few.
Yeah, I just read an article yesterday, in fact, about how raising the minimum wage lowers divorce rates. So, if there really is this concern about two-parent households being the answer to a lot of these social problems, okay, I'm completely open to that. But lecturing people doesn't necessarily have an effect on outcomes the way that simply supplying more material support to families who, are often fighting about money and getting divorced because of tensions that come from working so many hours and these kinds of things, that will have a real outcome. So let's go ahead and do that instead of just making it a kind of a culture war issue. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. We need to have more discussion. I think that's ultimately the point, is we need to have more open dialogue with one another, come to the table together, really hash it out and try not to assume the worst from the other side. Just say, let's come together. We're all Americans here. We all want the best for our country, for our kids, for our families, for individuals. That's what we want.
Yeah. Well, thank you for mooting that with me, Kim. We'll have more rising for you right after this.